Hi, my name is Nestor Wagner. I'm the instructor in charge of teaching this lecture on why candidates fail interpreting exams. I'm also the instructor in the state and federal court interpreting programs and also in the medical interpreting program. Today we'd like to discuss what are the typical problems that candidates experience when they take state examinations, interpreting state exams or federal exams. This is applicable both for court interpreting as well as for medical interpreting. The first thing that we would like to talk about is we'd like to look at the general overview of the exam and how the exam is actually graded. It's very important for candidates to know how the candidates will be graded when they take the exam. Sometimes lack of knowledge in this regard, in this particular area, tend to affect the outcome of an exam simply because the candidate doesn't know or just cannot prepare for the exam. So the exam taking techniques are not what the examiners are looking for. First of all, let me tell you that an exam is created, of course, an interpreting exam. We can concentrate, of course, on the oral component of the exam because that's usually where people fail the interpreting examination. In any interpreting exam, you will be tested on the three basic interpreting modes or modes of interpretation, which are consecutive, simultaneous, and sight translation. Consecutive is a technique where you hear a question in English, for example, you the interpreter, and then you interpret that question, and then you hear the answer, and once the answer is finished, then you interpret the answer. So clearly, in this particular technique, you need to wait and to remember what was said. Simultaneous is that technique where you, the interpreter, interprets at the same time, which is the one that most people are familiar with because they see that all the time. And sight translation is a technique where the interpreter is asked to read a document which is written, say, in English, and as the interpreter is reading the document in English, the interpreter is saying that in Spanish, into the opposite language. And you also have in the exam a second section of this component where the document now is in Spanish and the interpreter is asked to read it in Spanish and say it in English. So those are the three components. Now, in most interpreting exams, the main thing is accuracy. But we have to be very careful with this because accuracy becomes essential in those components where you have time to be accurate. What do I mean by that? Well, in a simultaneous, where you hear and interpret at the same time, accuracy is important, but it is not as important as in the consecutive, where you have the whole question or the whole answer was given to you, and you have enough time to put that answer in with the proper syntax into the opposite language. So we can say that in simultaneous, in that component, the message, delivering the message as accurately as possible is our goal. But we shouldn't be too concerned if we miss a word here, a word there. We should not be that concerned at all. We should be able to continue with it. At no time during the exam, you should stop when in the simultaneous. You have to keep going. Sometimes candidates think about a term, I know that term, and they keep thinking, but that's not a very good strategy for your exam, because if you think too much, then you're going to be missing the words that come afterwards. However, in consecutive and in sight translation, where you have some time to structure the message, then accuracy becomes essential. All interpreting exams, if you look on the screen now, have what is known as key units. And a key unit, by definition, is basically something that the examiner considers to be very important, and therefore the examiner will underline that key unit. Now, by definition, a key unit does not have to be a single term. It could be a whole sentence, it could be a series of words, one next to the other. It could be whatever the examiner considers that it is essential, particularly in the consecutive component. And so if you look at this example, John bought a brand new car. It is a red convertible with leather seats. He loves to drive it during weekends. What you see here underlined are considered to be key units. So brand new car is a key unit, red is a key unit, convertible is a key unit, leather seats also a key unit, and weekends a key unit. In most interpreting exams, the consecutive lasts approximately 20 minutes, and there will be approximately 50 key units. Depending on which exam, you may need to get either 70 or 80% of them correct. What does that mean to get them correct? Say, for example, that brand new car, you forget about, well, in this case, if you forget about brand new, then you really, let's say you forget about brand new and you only know brand new and you only know car, and you interpret car instead of brand new car. So the interpretation is, John, we never translate or interpret proper nouns. Compró un automóvil. And you forget un automóvil totalmente nuevo. You just forget about that. Well, if the key unit is worth at 1 point, then you did deliver car, but you didn't deliver brand new. So the examiner will probably take about half a point from there. So you do get some credit for the word that you mentioned, but not necessarily full credit for it because you didn't deliver the full segment or the full key unit. It is a red convertible. Please note here that red is by itself. Sometimes the key unit could be just a single term because it describes the automobile. There is a big difference between a red convertible and a blue convertible, particularly when somebody has to describe what car the person was driving at the scene of the crime. So this is considered to be either you know it or you don't know it. So there's no partial credit. If you don't know that it is red, then you got a problem. So that will be a deduction of 1 point if this unit is worth at 1 point. And so on and so forth. So that's the way the examiners grade you. And the same approach is used for sight translation. The sight translation component of the exam can last anywhere between, I would say, 10 and 14 minutes. And that's because it has 2 components, one document in English, then you interpret that you do a sight translation into Spanish, and another document in Spanish, and then you do that into the opposite language, into English. We'll see exactly how that technique works later on today. But they have a certain number of key units for each document, and usually in a sight translation component, the number of key units will be 20 per document. So if you need to get 70%, then you need to get 14 right, or 80% will be 16 right. It doesn't mean you have to get all of it right, because as I explained earlier, you may get partial credit for each one. So you can look at it this way. You start with 20 points in the sight translation. That's the maximum you can get. And every time there is a deduction, they deduct points from those 20 points. And at the end of that component, then if you ended up with 14, if the 70% is required, or 16 if 80% is required, then you pass that component of the exam. The other element that is important is accuracy. And accuracy usually is developed with practice. And not only practice, but also good technique. It's like playing sport. If you don't have any formal training, if you didn't have a coach who trained you how to play a particular sport, then your technique is going to be weak at all times. It may work fine sometimes, but sometimes it may not work that great. And by the same token, even if you have a coach that trains you in a given sport, and therefore you have a technique, if you don't have the practice, then you won't have the ability to use that technique properly, particularly under stressful situations, such as taking an examination. So accuracy is defined as how close it was to the original.